What if the most powerful way to handle a difficult conversation is not by speaking louder, arguing harder, or trying to defeat the other person, but by learning how to listen, understand, and communicate with wisdom? Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss explores negotiation, communication, human behavior, and the psychology behind difficult conversations. Drawing from the author's experience in high-stakes negotiation, the book presents ideas designed to help people understand what others want, communicate more effectively, and handle challenging situations with greater confidence. In this educational summary, we will focus on the practical and ethical lessons that can improve everyday communication. We'll explore why careful listening is often more powerful than immediately giving answers, how asking thoughtful questions can reveal important information, why emotions influence decisions, and how staying calm can prevent conversations from becoming unnecessary conflicts. We'll also examine the importance of understanding another person's perspective without automatically agreeing with it. Good communication does not require manipulation, dishonesty, intimidation, or taking unfair advantage of someone. Instead, it can be built on honesty, patience, respect, clear boundaries, and a genuine effort to find solutions that are fair to everyone involved. Throughout this summary, we'll explore techniques for handling disagreements, responding to difficult requests, clarifying misunderstandings, and communicating under pressure. These lessons can be useful in professional situations, business discussions, family conversations, teamwork, and everyday interactions. The goal is not simply to win conversations. A successful negotiation should ideally create understanding, protect important interests, and move both sides toward a reasonable solution. Strong communication combines confidence with humility, careful listening with clear expression, and firmness with respect. As we begin, keep one principle in mind: you cannot always control what another person says or wants, but you can control how thoughtfully, honestly, and responsibly you communicate. Let's begin this complete educational summary of Never Split the Difference. Every difficult conversation begins with a simple reality: people do not always see the same situation in the same way. Two individuals can hear the same words, face the same circumstances, and still have completely different expectations, concerns, and priorities. Understanding this difference is one of the foundations of effective communication. One of the most important lessons from Never Split the Difference is the value of careful listening. Many people listen only long enough to prepare their own response. They are already thinking about what they want to say next, how they will defend their position, or how they can convince the other person. Genuine listening is different. It requires attention, patience, and a willingness to understand what the other person is actually communicating. Listening does not mean agreeing with everything someone says. It simply means giving their words enough attention to understand their perspective. When people feel that they are being heard, conversations can become calmer and more productive. This is especially important when emotions are involved. Another valuable principle is recognizing emotions without allowing emotions to control the conversation. People make decisions for logical reasons, but emotions often influence how those decisions are understood. Fear, frustration, disappointment, excitement, and uncertainty can all affect communication. If we ignore these emotions, we may misunderstand what the other person truly needs. A thoughtful communicator therefore pays attention not only to the information being presented but also to the feelings behind it. If someone appears frustrated, immediately arguing against them may make the situation worse. A calmer approach is to understand why they feel that way and respond respectfully. This leads to another important skill: empathy. Empathy means making a genuine effort to understand another person's perspective. It does not require accepting their position as correct. You can understand why someone feels strongly about an issue while still maintaining your own position. For example, if a customer is disappointed with a service, acknowledging their frustration can help create a better conversation. You can recognize their experience without making promises you cannot keep. Similarly, during a disagreement between colleagues, understanding each person's concerns can make it easier to identify a practical solution. Another lesson is the importance of asking questions instead of making assumptions. Assumptions can create unnecessary misunderstandings because we often believe we know what another person wants without actually asking. Thoughtful questions encourage clarification and reveal information that might otherwise remain hidden. Open-ended questions can be especially useful because they give people space to explain their reasoning. Instead of immediately telling someone what they should do, asking how they see the situation can produce a much more informative conversation. This approach also demonstrates respect for their ability to think and make decisions. However, communication should remain honest. Questions should not be used to deceive, pressure, or manipulate someone into accepting something against their interests. The ethical purpose of good questioning is understanding, clarification, and finding a fair path forward. Another powerful principle is staying calm under pressure. Difficult conversations can become emotionally intense, especially when money, reputation, responsibilities, or personal relationships are involved. When emotions rise, people may speak too quickly or make statements they later regret. A calm communicator creates space between emotion and action. Taking a moment before responding can prevent unnecessary escalation. Speaking clearly, lowering unnecessary tension, and focusing on the actual issue can help move the conversation toward a solution. This does not mean becoming passive. Calmness and firmness can exist together. You can clearly communicate your limits while remaining respectful. You can reject an unfair proposal without insulting the person who made it. You can disagree strongly without turning disagreement into personal hostility. Another important lesson is understanding that compromise is not always the best first solution. People often assume that meeting halfway is automatically fair. But a compromise can sometimes leave both sides dissatisfied, especially when the real problem has not been understood. Before discussing numbers or final terms, it is often more useful to understand what each side actually values. For example, two people may disagree about a price when the real issue is timing, quality, reliability, or risk. Once the deeper concern becomes clear, a solution may exist that neither side originally considered. This is why effective negotiation begins with understanding rather than rushing toward agreement. The broader lesson is useful far beyond business. Families negotiate responsibilities. Students negotiate expectations with teachers and parents. Employees discuss responsibilities with managers. Friends resolve misunderstandings. Everyday life contains countless situations where communication matters. In all of these situations, the goal should not be to dominate the other person. The goal should be to communicate clearly, understand genuine concerns, protect important boundaries, and search for solutions that respect everyone involved. The strongest negotiator is therefore not necessarily the person who talks the most or argues the hardest. It is often the person who can listen carefully, remain calm, understand emotions, ask thoughtful questions, and communicate honestly under pressure. These skills form the foundation for better conversations, and better conversations can lead to better decisions, stronger relationships, and more responsible outcomes. One of the most powerful lessons in effective communication is that people want to feel understood before they are ready to consider a different perspective. In difficult conversations, facts and logic are important, but presenting them too quickly can make the other person defensive. A better approach begins by understanding what matters to them and showing that their concerns have been heard. This does not mean agreeing with every statement. Understanding and agreement are two different things. You can recognize someone's concerns while maintaining your own position. In fact, respectful understanding can make disagreement easier because people are less likely to feel that they are being ignored. A useful communication skill is reflecting important words and ideas back to the other person. When someone explains a concern, repeating a short portion of what they said can encourage them to continue explaining. This simple technique can reveal information that might otherwise remain hidden. For example, if someone says, "We don't have enough time to complete this," immediately responding with a solution may miss the real issue. Instead, you might ask what makes the timeline difficult. Perhaps the problem is not the deadline itself but limited staff, unclear instructions, or another responsibility competing for attention. Once the actual problem is understood, the conversation becomes much more productive. Another important lesson is labeling emotions respectfully. When people experience strong emotions, they may not always communicate their concerns clearly. Acknowledging the apparent emotion can reduce tension because it demonstrates that you are paying attention. If someone appears frustrated, a respectful observation such as, "It sounds like this situation has been frustrating," can create space for clarification. The person may explain what is actually bothering them. If your interpretation is incorrect, they can correct it. The purpose is not to manipulate emotions. It is to create understanding. Ethical communication requires honesty about what you observe and humility about the possibility that you may be wrong. This leads to an important principle: never assume that you completely understand another person's feelings. Human beings are complex, and the same behavior can have different causes. Someone who seems angry may actually be worried. Someone who appears unwilling to cooperate may be confused. Someone who rejects an offer may have concerns that have not yet been expressed. Careful communication gives people an opportunity to explain themselves. Another valuable skill is using silence appropriately. Many people become uncomfortable when a conversation becomes quiet, so they immediately fill the silence with more words. But silence can provide space for reflection. After asking an important question, allowing the other person time to think can produce a more thoughtful response. Silence should not be used as intimidation. Its value comes from patience. A communicator who is comfortable with a short pause is less likely to speak unnecessarily or make promises simply because the conversation feels uncomfortable. Another important principle is asking questions that encourage problem solving. Instead of telling someone exactly what they must do, thoughtful questions can encourage them to examine the situation themselves. For example, if a proposed solution creates a practical problem, asking, "How would that work with the current deadline?" may encourage the other person to reconsider the proposal without turning the conversation into an argument. This approach can be particularly useful when people have different priorities. A question can reveal constraints that were not obvious at the beginning. It can also encourage both sides to think about consequences rather than simply defending their positions. However, questions should never become a disguised form of pressure. Ethical negotiation respects the other person's freedom to make their own decision. The purpose is to discover a workable solution, not to force someone into accepting something they do not understand or genuinely agree with. Another important lesson is separating the person from the problem. Disagreement does not automatically mean that the other person is your enemy. A difficult negotiation can involve competing interests without requiring personal hostility. When people attack each other's character, the actual issue often becomes harder to solve. Instead of saying, "You're being unreasonable," it is usually more constructive to identify the specific problem. This condition creates a difficulty for us because clear communication focuses attention on the issue rather than turning the conversation into a personal conflict. This principle is valuable in family relationships as well. When disagreements occur, criticizing someone's character can create lasting resentment. Discussing the specific behavior or problem allows both people to address the situation without unnecessarily damaging their relationship. Another lesson is remaining patient when agreement does not happen immediately. Some conversations require time. People may need to think, gather information, consult others, or reconsider their priorities. Pressuring someone for an immediate answer can create unnecessary mistakes. Patience does not mean avoiding decisions forever. It means recognizing when additional information or reflection would improve the decision. A responsible communicator knows when to continue the discussion and when to allow time for consideration. The book also emphasizes the importance of clarifying what each person actually wants. Positions are often visible, but underlying interests may be less obvious. Someone may demand a particular outcome because they believe it protects something important. If that deeper concern is discovered, alternative solutions may become possible. For example, a person may insist on a particular schedule because they need reliability, not because they specifically care about that exact time. Understanding the underlying need creates more possibilities for a fair solution. This is why negotiation is fundamentally a communication process. Before discussing what each side should receive, we need to understand what each side values, fears, needs, and considers important. The strongest conversations therefore combine listening, empathy, patience, clear questions, emotional awareness, and honest communication. When these skills are practiced together, disagreements do not necessarily disappear, but they become easier to understand. And once people understand the real problem, they have a much better chance of finding a solution that is practical, respectful, and fair. Ultimately, effective negotiation is not about finding clever words to defeat another person. It is about understanding human behavior well enough to communicate responsibly, protect important interests, and move difficult conversations toward constructive outcomes. As communication becomes more thoughtful, another important lesson emerges: a successful negotiation begins with understanding what really matters to each side. People often focus on visible demands, but the demand itself may not explain the real reason behind it. A person may ask for a particular price, deadline, condition, or responsibility because they are trying to protect something more important underneath. Understanding that deeper concern can completely change a conversation. Imagine two people discussing a project deadline. One person insists that the work must be finished immediately, while the other believes the deadline is unrealistic. If both sides simply repeat their positions, the conversation may become an argument. But if they explore the reasons behind those positions, they may discover that one side is worried about a client commitment while the other is concerned about quality. Once those concerns are visible, the discussion can move toward possible solutions. This demonstrates an important principle: positions are not always the same as interests. A position is what someone says they want. An interest is the reason that outcome matters to them. Effective communication tries to understand both. One way to uncover these interests is through careful questioning. Instead of immediately defending your own position, ask questions that encourage the other person to explain their reasoning. Questions such as, "What is most important to you here?" or "What concern are you trying to solve?" can reveal information that is impossible to see from the original demand alone. The purpose of these questions should remain ethical. They should help both sides understand the situation, not provide a method for exploiting someone's weakness. Good negotiation creates clarity rather than deception. Another important lesson is that people often respond strongly when they feel that their concerns are being dismissed. Even when a proposal is objectively reasonable, the other person may resist if they believe their perspective has not been respected. This is why acknowledgement matters. Before presenting your own argument, demonstrate that you understand the concerns being expressed. A simple recognition of the problem can reduce unnecessary tension and make the conversation more productive. Acknowledgement is not surrender. It is simply accurate communication. You can say, in effect, "I understand why this matters to you," while still explaining why you cannot accept a particular request. Respectful disagreement is possible when both sides recognize that the other person has legitimate concerns. Another valuable principle is avoiding unnecessary pressure. Pressure may sometimes produce a quick agreement, but a forced agreement can create resentment, misunderstandings, or future problems. If someone feels trapped into accepting a decision, they may not genuinely support it. A better approach is to create enough space for thoughtful decisions. Explain the situation clearly, ask relevant questions, listen to concerns, and allow the other person to evaluate the options. This is especially important when decisions involve money, employment, contracts, responsibilities, or important personal relationships. The book also highlights the value of calm persistence. A difficult conversation does not always need to be solved in one exchange. If an agreement cannot be reached immediately, continuing respectfully can sometimes reveal new information. Persistence, however, should not become harassment. There is a difference between calmly returning to an important discussion and repeatedly pressuring someone after they have clearly declined. Ethical communication respects boundaries. Another important skill is recognizing when the conversation is becoming emotional. Once people feel attacked, embarrassed, or ignored, logical arguments may become less effective. Continuing to add more facts may not solve the problem because the real issue has become emotional rather than informational. In such moments, slowing down can be more productive than speaking faster. Acknowledge the tension, clarify what has been misunderstood, and return to the actual issue. Sometimes the best decision is to pause the conversation and continue later when both sides are calmer. This principle is useful far beyond business negotiations. Consider a disagreement between friends. One person may believe the other has ignored them, while the other person may not realize how their actions were perceived. If both immediately defend themselves, the disagreement can grow. If they first understand each other's perspective, the actual misunderstanding may become obvious. Another lesson is the importance of being precise with commitments. Vague promises can create future disagreements because each person may understand them differently. Clear communication reduces this risk. When discussing responsibilities, deadlines, prices, or expectations, it is useful to clarify exactly what has been agreed upon. What will happen? Who is responsible? When will it happen? What conditions apply? What happens if circumstances change? Clarity is not distrust. It is a way of preventing unnecessary confusion. The same principle applies to personal relationships. Clear expectations can prevent resentment. When people assume that others automatically understand what they need, misunderstandings become more likely. Respectful communication gives people the opportunity to clarify expectations before problems become serious. Another important lesson is knowing when an agreement is genuinely fair. The goal of negotiation should not be to obtain the maximum possible advantage at any cost. A healthy agreement should consider whether the outcome is practical, sustainable, and acceptable to the people involved. A deal that looks excellent today but creates resentment tomorrow may not be a successful deal. Long-term relationships require trust, and trust depends on fairness and reliability. This is particularly important in business. A company may gain a short-term advantage through aggressive behavior, but if customers, employees, or partners lose trust, the long-term consequences can be significant. Sustainable success requires more than winning individual negotiations. The deeper lesson is therefore thinking beyond the immediate outcome. Ask not only, can I get what I want, but also, will this solution work over time? Is it honest? Is it fair? Can both sides live with it? These questions transform negotiation from a contest into a process of responsible problem solving. Ultimately, strong negotiation combines empathy with boundaries, patience with persistence, confidence with humility, and communication with integrity. The objective is not to defeat another person. It is to understand the situation clearly enough to make a responsible decision. When both sides feel heard and the real issues are understood, difficult conversations become much more manageable. And when honesty remains at the center of the process, negotiation can strengthen relationships instead of damaging them. The real skill is not simply knowing how to persuade people. It is knowing how to communicate clearly, understand deeply, and make agreements responsibly. As we move deeper into the principles of effective negotiation, another important lesson becomes clear: good communication depends not only on what we say, but also on how carefully we understand the situation before responding. Many disagreements become difficult because people rush toward solutions before they have identified the real problem. When a conversation becomes complicated, slowing down can be more productive than speaking more. Ask questions. Listen carefully. Clarify expectations. Separate facts from assumptions. This process may feel slower at first, but it can prevent much larger problems later. One of the most useful habits is preparing before an important conversation. Preparation does not mean planning ways to manipulate another person. It means understanding your own position, identifying what matters most, considering reasonable alternatives, and thinking about the concerns the other person may have. Before entering a negotiation, ask yourself several questions. What outcome would be genuinely useful? Which conditions are essential? Which areas are flexible? What information am I missing? What risks should I consider? What would make the agreement sustainable for everyone involved? These questions create clarity. Without preparation, people can become overly emotional or accept conditions they did not properly evaluate. Another important principle is knowing your boundaries. Good communication requires knowing what you can and cannot accept. A person who enters every negotiation without clear boundaries may become pressured into decisions that create problems later. Boundaries should be communicated respectfully. You can clearly say that a particular condition does not work for you without insulting or threatening the other person. Firmness becomes much more effective when it is combined with calmness and respect. This also applies to everyday relationships. If someone repeatedly asks you to take on responsibilities that you cannot reasonably manage, saying yes every time may eventually create resentment. A respectful boundary allows you to protect your time while maintaining a healthy relationship. Another valuable lesson is not confusing confidence with aggression. Confidence means understanding your position and communicating it clearly. Aggression attempts to overpower the other person. These are very different approaches. Aggressive communication may create fear or temporary compliance, but it can damage trust. Confident communication allows disagreement while maintaining respect. You can be direct without being insulting. You can disagree without humiliating someone. You can protect your interests without trying to dominate another person. This distinction becomes especially important when emotions rise. When people feel threatened, they may become defensive. Harsh language can make them focus more on protecting themselves than solving the problem. A calmer approach keeps attention on the actual issue. Another important principle is avoiding unnecessary assumptions about someone's intentions. When another person behaves unexpectedly, we may immediately decide that they are being dishonest, disrespectful, or selfish. Sometimes that interpretation is correct, but sometimes there is information we do not know. Instead of assuming, ask for clarification. This habit can prevent many unnecessary conflicts. A delayed response might have a reasonable explanation. A disagreement might come from different information. A rejection might reflect a limitation rather than hostility. Clarification gives reality an opportunity to replace assumption. The book also emphasizes the value of careful wording. Certain statements can unintentionally make people defensive. Telling someone what they must do can feel controlling, while asking how a solution could work may encourage cooperation. This does not mean avoiding direct communication. Important responsibilities sometimes require clear statements. The goal is to communicate firmly without unnecessarily creating resistance. Another useful principle is giving people an opportunity to think. When a person receives too much information or pressure at once, they may respond emotionally rather than thoughtfully. A calm conversation allows time for reflection. This is particularly important when the decision has significant consequences. People should have enough information to understand what they are agreeing to. Ethical negotiation never depends on hiding important facts or confusing someone into accepting an arrangement. Transparency builds trust. Another lesson is the importance of listening for contradictions and unclear expectations. Sometimes people say one thing while their concerns suggest something different. Instead of immediately accusing them of inconsistency, ask questions that clarify what they mean. For example, if someone says that cost is the most important issue but also requires several expensive features, there may be another priority influencing the decision. Perhaps they are concerned about reliability or long-term value. Understanding this can make the conversation much easier. This is why effective negotiation requires curiosity. A curious communicator does not assume they already know everything. They remain willing to discover new information. Another powerful principle is being willing to walk away from an unfair arrangement. Not every agreement should be accepted. Sometimes the best decision is to say no. Walking away does not mean creating hostility. It can simply mean recognizing that the available options do not meet reasonable requirements. Protecting yourself from a harmful agreement is part of responsible decision-making. At the same time, walking away should not become a tactic for threatening people unnecessarily. If you say you will leave, the statement should be genuine. Empty threats can destroy credibility. Credibility is one of the strongest assets in communication. When people know that your words are reliable, they take your commitment seriously. When promises are repeatedly made and broken, trust becomes difficult to maintain. Another lesson is thinking about the long-term relationship rather than only the immediate transaction. A short-term victory can become a long-term loss if it destroys trust. This is especially true when dealing with people you expect to work with again. Fairness, honesty, and reliability create relationships that can continue beyond a single negotiation. When people trust each other, future communication becomes easier because less energy is spent protecting against unexpected behavior. This principle applies to business, employment, friendships, family relationships, and teamwork. Strong relationships are built through repeated experiences of honest and respectful communication. Ultimately, effective negotiation is not simply a collection of clever techniques. It is a disciplined approach to understanding people, protecting legitimate interests, communicating clearly, and making thoughtful decisions. The strongest communicator knows when to speak, when to listen, when to ask questions, when to set a boundary, and when to step away. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: a successful conversation should not require you to sacrifice honesty or another person's dignity. When communication is built on respect and integrity, even difficult disagreements can become opportunities for understanding, better decisions, and stronger relationships. As we reach the end of this educational summary of Never Split the Difference, one central lesson stands out: effective negotiation begins with understanding people, not defeating them. Everyday life contains countless negotiations. We negotiate responsibilities at home, expectations at work, prices in business, schedules with others, and solutions when disagreements arise. In each situation, the quality of our communication can influence the final outcome. One of the most important skills we explored is listening carefully. Instead of preparing our response while someone else is speaking, we can give them our full attention and try to understand what they actually mean. Listening does not require agreement. It simply creates the foundation for understanding. We also examined the importance of recognizing emotions. People do not communicate through facts alone. Feelings such as frustration, fear, disappointment, uncertainty, and excitement can influence decisions. When we recognize these emotions respectfully, conversations can become calmer and more productive. Another major lesson is the value of thoughtful questions. Questions can reveal information that assumptions cannot. They encourage people to explain their concerns and can uncover the real issue behind a disagreement. When used honestly, questions become tools for understanding rather than manipulation. We also explored empathy. Understanding another person's perspective does not mean surrendering your own position. It means recognizing that another person may have reasons, concerns, or experiences that you do not immediately see. Empathy allows disagreement to remain respectful. A strong communicator also understands the importance of boundaries. Being respectful does not mean accepting every request. We can clearly explain what we can and cannot accept while avoiding unnecessary hostility. Firmness and kindness can exist together. Another important lesson is remaining calm under pressure. Difficult conversations can create strong emotions, but immediate reactions can make problems worse. A short pause can provide enough time to choose words carefully and consider the consequences of a response. We also learned that compromise is not automatically the best solution. Meeting halfway may sometimes be useful, but it can also leave the deeper problem unresolved. Before searching for a compromise, it is better to understand what each side actually needs and why those needs matter. This is where preparation becomes important. Before entering a significant negotiation, understand your priorities, identify reasonable alternatives, consider risks, and clarify your boundaries. Preparation creates confidence because you know what you are trying to achieve and what you are unwilling to accept. Another lesson is clarity. Agreements should be understandable. Important responsibilities, deadlines, prices, expectations, and conditions should not remain unnecessarily vague. Clear communication reduces misunderstandings and protects relationships. We also discussed the importance of honesty and transparency. Negotiation should never depend on deception, hidden information, intimidation, or taking unfair advantage of another person. A successful agreement should be one that people can accept with a clear understanding of what they are agreeing to. This principle becomes even more important when relationships continue after the negotiation. A short-term advantage is rarely worth destroying long-term trust. Reputation develops through repeated behavior, and people remember whether we communicate honestly and keep our commitments. Another powerful lesson is knowing when to walk away from an unsuitable agreement. Not every deal or arrangement is beneficial. Sometimes saying no is the responsible decision. Walking away respectfully protects your interests without turning disagreement into personal conflict. Perhaps the deepest lesson is that negotiation is not limited to business. These skills can improve ordinary conversations as well. Listening to family members, resolving misunderstandings with friends, communicating with colleagues, discussing responsibilities, and handling disagreements all require patience and emotional awareness. The goal is not to control people. The goal is to communicate clearly enough that everyone understands the situation and can make informed decisions. From an ethical perspective, the most valuable lessons are therefore simple: listen before judging, understand before responding, ask before assuming, remain calm under pressure, communicate honestly, respect boundaries, and seek solutions that are fair and sustainable. Good negotiation does not require manipulation. It requires discipline. It does not require aggression. It requires confidence. It does not require deception. It requires clarity. And it does not require defeating another person. It requires finding a responsible way forward. As you move into your own conversations, remember that your words have consequences. A thoughtful question can prevent an argument. A calm response can reduce tension. Honest communication can strengthen trust. And genuine listening can reveal solutions that neither side could see at the beginning. The strongest negotiator is not necessarily the person who gets everything they want. It is the person who can protect what matters, understand others, communicate with integrity, and make wise decisions without sacrificing fairness or respect. Thank you for joining me for this complete educational summary of Never Split the Difference. Use these lessons not to manipulate people, but to become a clearer communicator, a better listener, and a more responsible decision maker.